Alright, so today is just going to be a prediction video of Cod Champs. Just a prediction of each round and match in the bracket and see who's going to win and predict who's going to win pretty much. So, first round, New York versus Minnesota. I chose New York since Minnesota haven't had X-Seed for that long and they don't have God or X instead of X-Seed, and I think that Minnesota don't have that much experience with X-Seed to face New York and beat them, just because New York has had more experience with their players and also they have more firepower since they don't have God or Rex anymore, which was one of the best, at least I believe one of the best players in the Call of Duty League. So next round, Toronto versus London. I chose Toronto just because they won a home series and their form should be great enough to fight for the top four, but not enough to even get into the top four. I'll explain later why. Just because of that, Toronto should beat London unless London drastically improves with this new meta, which I doubt. But Toronto just edging out London just because I don't know if London has improved that much with the new meta. While Toronto, I know they've won a home series and I know that they have the talent to beat London. Next, Los Angeles Guerrillas versus Optic LA. I chose Optic LA just to win, just because of pure firepower. I don't think they even need that much strategy. LA Guerrillas have really talented players, it's just that they haven't put it together, while Optic LA have veterans like Slasher, Kenny, and they have the two youngsters that have come in with Draza, and I forgot the other guy. And also they have, who's that other player? I keep forgetting players' names. I just don't watch Optic that much, I don't really care about them. So Optic LA just to beat them just because of pure firepower, and if LA Guerrillas beat them, it's gonna probably be just a very close game, or Optic LA just haven't improved at all. I'm just expecting them to improve at least a little. Alright, next we have Paris Legion versus Seattle. This one could go either way, at least I think so. I think that Paris has the talent to beat Seattle and has better communication since their roster hasn't changed that much, while Seattle has made roster changes, and also Seattle haven't merged yet as a team fully, but they also have a lot more talent than Paris since Seattle has Octane, they have Apathy, who usually improves by the end of the season, and they have Pander, who is a pretty decent AR, and then they also have Proto, who's very aggressive just like Kismet, so if Proto has his day, Kismet could easily lose. So it's a 50-50. I chose Seattle just because if they improve during this break, I think Seattle could improve way more, and also the meta change, so which helps them since they have more flex players pretty much. Next, Huntsmen versus New York. I believe Huntsmen would beat New York just barely, just by a little, just because even though New York beat them before and New York won that home series that they beat them on, which was the New York home series, it's just that New York hasn't looked strong recently. New York looks very weak, especially in the last home series they were in. They went from winning to getting knocked out in the first round. Sorry if you heard my keyboard. So New York just drastically went up and then fell down. So I don't know if they're gonna show up this year in this champs. I don't know. I believe they can. It's just that I don't know if they improved with this meta. Next, Florida versus Toronto. I chose Florida to win, Toronto to lose. Even though Toronto is very strong, I still believe that the top four is Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, and Florida. Toronto could edge in there and fight for it, but it just looks very unlikely because the last home series Toronto won. Even though I thought they were going to win it still, I still think that the top teams weren't showing up that home series, if people get what I mean. I just think that the top teams were just not there. They were playing off, they were playing rough, they weren't playing smoothly like how they usually do. They weren't rotating as much, they weren't winning their gunfights. So I think they were just having an off tournament pretty much. Next, Minnesota versus Optic LA. Again, X seed instead of God RX. If God RX was there, I probably think Minnesota could win it. But since it's a new roster and communication may be off, and also the new roster mistakes might have been, and also the firepower isn't as strong, even though I believe X seed is a really good player, he's just not God RX. So Optic LA to win just because of firepower, and also if they improve with the communication, it could be a blowout. But I don't think it will. Probably be game 4 or even game 5. Next, London versus Seattle. I chose London, obviously. If it was Paris or Seattle, I still would have chose London. I don't believe those two guys are as good as they used to. Like Paris, I don't think they're as good as the home series, because it was just one home series, and you saw what happened to New York, one home series, and then they fell off. So they could have fallen off back to where they are in Seattle's form. So I believe London would beat them just by the form they're in. They could still beat them. If they improve, they could beat them. So unless Seattle or Paris improves drastically, like their communication went from rough to perfect or like barely any errors in their communication, because that's the only thing they have a problem with, communicating and doing the right things on the map and executing those things well. So next, Atlanta versus Chicago. I chose Chicago to beat them just because I was thinking, well, last year Optic versus 100 Thieves, they beat them. 100 Thieves beat Optic, and they were never able to beat them the whole year. Even though it's only one match, I think Atlanta got blown out to the point where Atlanta have that in the back of their heads and thinking, well, we can't really beat these guys, or like they're doubting and what if they can beat them, or they're playing not to lose. So that's why Huntsmen would win, but just barely. I think it wouldn't be a blowout. It'd probably be a 3-1 or 3-2. Next, Dallas versus Mutineers. I chose Mutineers to go on to the winners finals just because they barely edge out Dallas, just because of the form Dallas is in. I don't think they're in perfect form like how they were during their wins. Since they went to semifinals and they lost, I believe that Dallas isn't horrible. It's just that they're just not as good as they used to be. But by the scrims, I think they have improved, but also Florida has still stayed strong, so it's going to be very close. It could be 50-50 and either one could win. So next, Toronto versus LA. Toronto wins just because Optic has had easy matches until getting to Toronto. So Optic beat LA Gorillas and then Minnesota, and now you're facing somebody who could contest for top 4. So I believe that Optic LA either has to improve their communication and form as a team and get rid of those new team mistakes to beat Toronto, because Toronto right now is a team. They are together. They work as a team. Unlike Optic LA, they miscommunicate and they make mistakes, like how they were doing in the S&D. In the home series, they're playing against Toronto, and that's what made them lose. If they were together, they would have won against Toronto, and they would have had an easier chance beating them. Since Toronto only won because they were doing mistakes, and Toronto beat them just because of those mistakes. If they get rid of those mistakes, they probably have enough firepower to beat Toronto. Next, New York Subliners versus London. London, barely. I chose barely London over New York, just because I don't know if New York has improved during the scrimmages. And also, London, if they improve during scrims, they still have that talent in Wuskin and Scraps, and also Zero. So that just by that core, they have a strong team, and also they play together. They don't play to slay out. They don't have that much talent to where they just play individually. Even though Wuskin, I believe, is one of the best ARs this year, they would beat New York with the forms they have shown before. But unless New York has improved drastically with this new meta, I think London would beat them. Next, I'm going to start off with Mutineers and Chicago in the winners finals. Florida, I'd say barely beats Chicago, but I also think that it could also be a blowout, depending if Chicago still has that idea in the back of their heads that Minnesota is a way better team, and Minnesota, in the back of their heads, Chicago is thinking, Minnesota, we've never beat these guys. Even when Pristine was on there, we couldn't beat these guys when Pristine was on there, but now Pristine is on our team, and we still can't beat them now that they have Pharaoh. And also they have Awakening, which nullified most of their disadvantages they had. What if we can't beat these guys? If they still think like that, Florida's gonna wipe. I'm sorry if I said Minnesota the whole time. Florida's gonna wipe the floor with them. So Florida is gonna beat them barely. If Chicago isn't thinking that way, if Chicago is thinking, what if Mutineers beat us again for like the fourth time. So that's my prediction for that one. Mutineers going to the finals and Chicago going to the winners finals. Next, Atlanta versus Toronto. I choose Atlanta just because Atlanta should improve from the last home series and they shouldn't be playing as scrappy. And Toronto doesn't have as much talent, even though they have Cammy and Kleenex. Those guys fry. But Atlanta also has some pretty terrifying players. They have the Tiny Terrors, and they also have Priesta and Celium. Celium being probably a candidate for being one of the best they are, or being the best they are, depending on who you think is the best they are. It's like the Titans versus just one or two superstars, pretty much. So if Atlanta fixes their mistakes from last home series and play cohesively, Toronto is going to have trouble since they don't have as much firepower, and Atlanta will probably beat them. At least I think 3-1 or probably game 5 again, and then Atlanta barely scrapes out of it. Next, Dallas versus London. Dallas, I think, would beat London just because they are just another tier above them. Unless London improves drastically, I don't think London has that much of a chance. Unless, obviously, London improves drastically with this new meta. But I don't know that yet. I haven't watched the scrims, or they haven't even streamed the scrims. So I don't even know. And unless, London improves drastically. Next, Atlanta versus Dallas. I chose Dallas just barely because Atlanta has played 50-50 with Dallas. They don't know who's better. Sometimes Dallas is better, sometimes Atlanta is better, sometimes it looks pretty even. So it just depends on who's improved the most. And from the last home series, even though Atlanta went to the finals, I think Dallas could improve the most just because the new RAM could help their players be more flexible and be more dangerous, pretty much. Next, Dallas versus Chicago. Even though I am a Chicago fan, I think Chicago would lose to Dallas just because they haven't fixed their communication. And if they do, then Chicago would beat them. And obviously this goes back to Atlanta versus Dallas, because if Atlanta fixes their issues, Dallas could beat them. And if Dallas fixes their issues, Dallas could beat Atlanta. So this all comes to whoever shows up that day. And this could also be different. It could be Chicago versus Atlanta finals, or Chicago versus Mutineers Atlanta finals, or Dallas versus Atlanta, or it depends. Whoever shows up that day. So in the finals, I chose Mutineers just because they edged it over Dallas. They don't have as many issues, and also they have proven they could beat Dallas in semifinals and all that. But besides that, top 4, it could go to anybody. And also Toronto could sneak in there, or New York or London could sneak in there. So it really depends on who shows up that day. I think this is where I'm ending the video. Enough from me. Hopefully y'all enjoyed this video, and I'll see you on the next one.